As Howard said, this is going to be co-chaired by Howard and myself. And basically, sorry, I'm just trying to turn the notifications off on my Teams. Yeah, essentially, we're just going to be having a kind of conversational style discussion with Sophie Lewis about her book, Full Surrogacy Now. So for those of you who don't know, Full Surrogacy Now kind of articulates a new vision for understanding pregnancy in the context of family abolition and makes the case for understanding reproductive labour as like a form of productive work. Oh, sorry, I didn't know how to turn my roof. Okay. Could
Chloe, you've muted yourself. You've muted yourself again.
Sorry, the settings keep muting me. I think we're good now. All right. So yeah, Full Surrogacy Now kind of articulates a new vision for understanding pregnancy in the context of family abolition and kind of makes a case for understanding reproductive labour as a form of productive work. So focusing on the exploitative conditions in the global surrogacy industry, it kind of makes us see the logic of the capitalist marketplace and how it underpins our understanding of motherhood and kinship. So it kind of puts a history of the family and parental ownership over their children as a form of capitalist property owning and argues for a new collective understanding of care and ties of belonging. So we kind of want to focus on that understanding of collective kinship that's kind of built on in the book and how it relates to our current socio-political conditions. So obviously with like the current COVID-19 context and the crisis of care, we want to discuss the need for a feminism that looks beyond the oppressive structures of the patriarchal family. And that's kind of the conversation that me and Howard will be having with Sophie today. Yeah, so we're just gonna, I guess we'll get started. If that's okay with Sophie? Cool. Yeah, so Howard, do you want to start the discussion?
Oh yeah, so I guess the best place to start is just to ask, like, if you could say a kind of a brief few words about why you wrote your book Full Surrogacy Now, and sort of what sort of interventions you were hoping to make, and yeah, just give some sort of background to your kind of writing and your theorizing around family abolition.
Great. Well, first of all, hi. Thanks, Howard and Chloe, for inviting me. I really enjoy speaking to groups of people like this, particularly in a format that isn't simply a straightforward lecture, but could potentially involve a lot of discussion and mutual learning. I'm sort of curious and hungry to make contact with, human beings in general, really, this pandemic, but particularly, a BMA campaign at students, suffering under COVID in the UK. So thanks for all being here in such large numbers. Yeah, so to answer your question, Howard, yeah, there are sort of lots of different ways of explaining how I came to write the book. The two main ones probably being, reasons of personal family trauma as a queer person, and other reasons having to do with a fascination via a really unorthodox academic migration through different disciplines in what is sometimes called the production of nature. So I started off in English literature, and then I sort of went over to an environmental policy master's, and then I did some more graduate study in politics, and I ended up doing a PhD in human geography, which was supposed to be a quite abstract, not case study based theorization about anti-work political theorizing and critical theorizing about nature and how those two things spoke to each other. And in a way, the thesis or dissertation, depending on whether you're being American or European or whatever, that I ended up writing was basically that. Oh, I'm hearing lots of people's background from their respective computers. Okay. Yeah. So basically, I was arguing with my PhD advisors about the limits of the human and various kinds of Harawayvian challenges to the orthodox Marxist conception of labor power as tethered to this this notion of the human that in some ways queer feminists and Black feminists have really challenged. And although my advisors purported to take these challenges, these sort of queer biologies, Black feminist materialisms, and sort of revolutionary post-humanisms seriously, in reality, it didn't seem like they did, and they weren't interested in what I thought was a really interesting example one day just to think about, which was the xeno-hospitality of simple pregnancy. And you could say it was just a very basic 101 feminist moment, really, where two great white cis male Marxists weren't interested in thinking about the generativity, the productivity, the agentive character of gestationality, right, of pregnancy. And I'm not someone who ever thought that they would be dedicated to thinking about reproduction, the maternal, and so on. But there it is. I latched on to an example that I brought up in one conversation with my supervisors, and then I ended up turning my entire project into an inquiry into the work of gestating in paid and unpaid contexts, because I was convinced that there was a lot being taken for granted that really needed to be reframed and unpacked, because in academia I saw people talking about assisted reproduction as though we already had all agreed that it was something quite distinct, which implies that there's such a thing as unassisted reproduction. And my convictions are quite different, that there is no such thing as an unassisted form of reproduction. The thing, this is really in the tradition of ideology critique. When I say full surrogacy now, there are two main kind of dialectically opposed meanings of that sequence of words. And it's funny because that phrase did actually come to me right at the beginning of the project, before I really knew how I was going to flesh it out through an inquiry into one particular clinic and so on and so forth. But full surrogacy now is simultaneously a kind of description of this dystopian present, which is a situation of reproductive stratification in which you have a kind of fiction of an autonomous household, a nuclear family that is almost like a metaphor for value itself. We imagine that it is somehow self-sustaining, self-valorizing, an autonomous organism. But in reality, that household has all these kinds of surrogate flows of labor coming into it. And it is the labor of racialized, feminized, colonized laborers and lives distributed unevenly across the earth, who are sort of pouring their energy, in a sense, into that household. So that's kind of the full dystopian surrogacy that we actually have under capitalism. But full surrogacy now in the utopian sense would be an affirmative actualization of that already latent reality that we are at stake to one another, that we are the makers of one another in a very real material sense, and that we therefore need to learn how to really act like it, and enact a reproductive justice, a comradeliness, a transgenerational mode of care that really guarantees, that no one falls outside of a provision of love and support, really. So I was thinking about how surrogacy was an object of study that wasn't being linked to the very rich history of feminist and queer and Black critiques of the household. For instance, wages for housework and the entire Italian autonomist Marxist feminist critique of what they called the social factory, and their throwaway line in their manifesto that every miscarriage is a workplace accident, which already was an analysis of pregnancy as one of the myriad forms of care work that is invisibilized as work and which should be struggled against after it has been recognized as work, by the many gendered women, if you like, of the world. And I was really struck by how there was this segregation of the two topics, if you like, the topic of a sort of naturalized reproductive workplace, and then this kind of supposedly new assisted commodified sector, right? And so I basically that was how I got into it. Of course, it took me quite a while to realize my personal investments, if you like. And for those of you who have read the book, I include an anecdote, somewhat towards the end of the book, where I remembered in the middle of writing that I had a very sort of traumatic experience of asking my biological father whether, if he found out that my brother and I were, genetically speaking, the children of the milkman, he would suddenly not love us anymore. And the need I had as a child asking that question was quite, will be quite clear to all of us here. And the need is also something that a lot of parents of all kinds understand. And I should be clear that I by no means believe that there is somehow no liberatory love or comradeliness to be found within supposedly biological families or traditional households or so on. But what happened to me was that my dad just didn't say anything, and I didn't get the answer that I needed. And so I think I began on a journey towards thinking about the metaphors and fictions that we use to think of ourselves as held and as belonging to one another. And it led to a curiosity about the vast anthropological and philosophical literature on kinship, which I would probably summarize very brutally as, kinship is always made, not given. And in that sense, biofam, as Helen Hester calls it, and xenofam, which is the notion of a familiality that extends to the alien, have significant potential areas of overlap, right? So, okay, I've rambled on for quite some time, but to summarize, there were some sort of personal traumatic reasons why, and then some contingent kind of curiosities about nature and work, which as a sort of anti-work type of, communist feminist, I happened to latch onto in the unlikely seeming context of simple pregnancy. So there you go.
That's amazing. Thank you. That was like a really good overview. Thank you so much. I think we found what you said really interesting, particularly about how, well, at least I found it really interesting what you said about kind of care networks as things that aren't given but are constructed. And I think that's a really empowering way of thinking about kind of care. So I guess that, like, in the context of COVID-19, I guess, which is kind of one of the reasons that care is so relevant, and maybe one of the reasons that so many people are interested in this topic right now, especially amongst students as well, is that so many of the networks that we relied on throughout the pandemic and continue to are ones that were actively constructed. The mutual aid networks, students supporting each other last term when they were forced to return to campus. So I guess kind of it would be really cool to kind of know your feelings about how you feel COVID-19 has kind of exposed the value of more communal networks of care. And that'd be a really interesting way to maybe start the conversation after that summary.
Yeah, great. It's a really vital and really difficult question. And one of the reasons it's difficult is the fact that sort of everyone is talking about it. Liberals, neoliberals, neoconservatives, conservatives, radicals. There's a strange kind of impression, a cosmetic sense of a unanimity almost, that there is something really wrong. And you have to listen very carefully and think very hard about the distinctions and the ways that certain types of criticism of the nuclear household are not actually pointing towards a thoroughgoing transformation and a truly structural overhaul, of this violent mode of production and reproduction that we might call the capitalocene, and it's just since I mentioned this idea of the epochal ecological kind of character of this whole question, we should include in every conversation about COVID the fact that that it is our productivity and our urbanism, the manner in which we have built our landscapes and our worlds, that are destroying the means of life, right? It is deeply unecological for us to live in tiny little boxes that replicate all the means of reproduction again and again and again. Every tiny little box with its own laundry, its own kitchen, etc., etc., etc. Increasingly, people live in one-person households, right? This is reported on widely. Everyone from The Economist to fascists to anarchists are worried about it, which is this sort of fascinating and sometimes quite queasy kind of thing. And you can say quite reactionary things in favor of community and so on. And I will also throw in there that we seem to be having a collective fascination with cults, right? End of the world sort of existential crisis seems to really push people in ways that I think we do collectively understand into the deep togetherness of conspiracy and cult. And we watch documentaries about it because we're sort of attracted, fascinated, repelled, But okay, so yeah, having said all those kinds of disclaimers and avoidant remarks, I guess let's see, I wrote in The Nation in an article that they decided to call COVID-19 is straining the concept of the family. Let's break it. Since the beginning of the COVID lockdown, two things have sort of become, I think, more widely inescapable and difficult to repress from our collective consciousness, right? And that's the human body's interconnectedness and porosity, and also the genuinely deathly character of private property. And so those two things are sort of huge to unpack, you know, and I've explored the topic of our kind of almost moral panic about porosity, and the way it reflects almost a revival of the AIDS era sexual panic, with its kind of same social dynamics of sort of suspicion and punitive attitudes towards people seen as promiscuous, itinerant, contagious, and so on and so forth. And of sort of, you know, you can also think about the widespread reports of COVID era erotophobia, you know, and sort of a pandemic of kind of sexual sort of prudery that is being confused with epidemiological responsibility. The correct antidote for which might be an organized kind of process of reading groups dedicated to things like Douglas Crimp's How to Have Promiscuity in an Epidemic, which is one of these key texts from the AIDS era that, you know, helps promote grassroots education about the difference, you know, between isolation and epidemiological responsibility, you know, the collective tenderness and of masking up and being epidemiologically caring with one another's lives, fragile, beautiful, important lives, you know, but the difference between that and locking yourself in a box with, you know, all the technological and accoutrements and facilities that you need to, you know, to bunker down until the apocalypse has passed or whatever. And then, yeah, the aspect about private property, I think, is very important because, in my view, you know, the settler colonial state and the police, the military, the armed wings of capitalism exist primarily really to, you know, to protect private property under neoliberalism. And this is itself the, you know, the object that has been under assault where I live in the United States several times this year, right? I just want to sort of throw out there that we have had several huge, extraordinary uprisings, you know, of Black liberatory rage and utopianism of a kind, right? In the US, in the sort of, you know, righteous, riotous, looting-based expression of, you know, mourning over the, you know, the murders of various Black people by the United States' you know, cops. And yeah, I think it's really important to notice the way that every time there is a riot in the US, a politician will ascribe it to the supposed breakdown of the family, right? This literally happens every single time. It's a breakdown of the family that is supposedly the cause of, you know, of generative, wonderful things like shops being on fire, right? And I think in a sense, you know, rather than kind of condemn that reactively, I want to suggest or open up the possibilities for us thinking about that with almost an element of agreement, right? Those populations that have always been marginalized and excluded from the sort of the wages of the nuclear family, right? Because as Hortense Spillers tells us, both binary gender and nuclear kinship were sort of invented off the back of enslaved populations, really, on the plantation. And so in a polemical sense, the Black family is an oxymoron, right, for Black radicals in the tradition of Spillers. And Blackness is a condition of a certain kind of kinful kinlessness. It is those structurally queer populations that have been excluded from the wages of the nuclear household fiction ideal, disciplinary apparatus, whatever you want to call it, who have paradoxically necessarily also learned how to enact care skillfully and joyfully and well, and this is why Audre Lorde calls it a matter of those of us who were never meant to survive, who have these kinds of knowledges of polymaternal, transgenerational, and emancipatory care, right? And that's, in a sense, the content that I think is sometimes missing from discussions of care, which really have proliferated, right? Like I say, everyone in every sense, in every institution is talking about care. And I think when we decouple it from the sort of radically anti-colonial, anti-capitalist content, of the history of care struggle and what I would call family abolitionism, although you can also call it reproductive justice, or whatever there are a whole bunch of other synonyms in my opinion. But if we decouple it from the sense that, reproduction for many people is a sort of creative insurrection, not simply a kind of, it can never be thought of as somehow value neutral, right? You can't just increase care. You have to ask what kind of care. And sometimes in academic discussions in particular, there is a really static, sort of almost hollow definition of care that seems to be in play, that doesn't really want to qualitatively transform the world and abolish work, which is really the main antagonist of care, but wants to simply sort of redistribute a little bit so that we, there's somehow better time management perhaps, or a little bit of better sharing. And don't get me wrong, it's vital that cis heterosexual men do more of the housework in the present or whatever, but that seems like a very transitional demand to me, because I think moments like this allow more people to glimpse that we could end cis heteropatriarchal dyadic forms of living entirely, and not just kind of tweak them so that they're a little bit more tolerable, and we could truly start to to collectivize living and form lifelong commitments to people that aren't simply sexual romantic couple form type partnerships or marriage equivalents, and perhaps some of the sorts of associated techniques with that would be reviving the expectation that children belong to everyone and belong to no one, and that the idea of sort of registering children to a very limited number of kind of authors, you know, of their biogenetic material, you know, is perhaps something we could slowly, you know, unlearn. You know, maybe one day we would think of it as really weird to have sort of 1 or 2 names on a child's birth certificate, as though, you know, they are somehow you know, owned in a sense by those people, right? Because you know, every neoliberal from, you know, Hillary Clinton says it takes a village to make a child. You know, okay. What that sort of nice phrase always conceals, however, is that there's a radically hierarchical, proprietarian kind of logic at the heart of that. And the romance of the village sort of really just serves to conceal the sort of the bad sense of surrogacy, right? Which I'm arguing we need to make visible so that we can kind of turn it on its head. But yeah, why don't you tell me a little bit about what it's like to be an undergraduate in a situation where you have to stay 6 feet away from most people while living perhaps away from your, you know, biogenetic nuclear or biolegal kin, although maybe not, you know, for the first time, you know, in your adult lives.
I think that I mean, I can't speak for everyone on this call who's a student, and I think it's kind of a very individual, individual, not the right word to say in this context. It's a very personal experience for everyone. I mean, I could say, speaking personally as a queer person as well, being in a house away from home with other queer people has been a great experience. And particularly in enacting kind of like that understanding of care that comes from like living with the people I choose to live with. And I feel like that's the same for a lot of students. I think particularly, as I was saying, like kind of before, about how we've kind of all had to form our own communal networks of care in the absence of like universities providing some of the institutional forms of care that they should. And I think we've really seen with students, like a lot of them have been forced to live away from like homes that they may call home, and some people call university home, so it's not the same for everyone. But like in the context of the pandemic in particular in the last term, it's been really amazing to see how students have formed what you kind of, I guess, would call those more organic forms of care that you build and you don't consider given, and they're not kind of care that exists in a power dynamic of property and not being the property of another person who's a biogenetic parent, perhaps. And that's really come across with students, I feel, at least, and it's been a really great thing to observe. Yeah, I don't know if Howard has anything to add, but that's, I guess, my kind of view of like how we feel like the students. It's very much been a student-led effort of like communal care, and that's why we're all talking about care so much.
Yeah, it's been quite similar for me as well. And I mean, I do wonder kind of when we move on to the audience Q&A, what kind of other people on here kind of have to say about that. But we have a bit of time before we go for a quick break, and I thought maybe it'd be fun to ask a kind of a question looking at like approaching this discussion from a different lens. So kind of you've spoken like both in your book and here about how the family, like the bourgeois family, is inextricably linked with capitalism and its kind of associated histories of colonialism and imperialism. So kind of I wondered, how does the project of dismantling the nuclear family, how does the project of family abolition, how does that link to wider kind of revolutionary struggles against the colonial state and against capitalism, and how can us thinking in kind of abolitionist terms open up new opportunities for us to imagine and live in a world beyond like capitalism and colonialism?
a nice, easy question there, Howard. Yes, and also the most vital one, right? Yeah, well, several things to say, and I will not be able to say all that needs to be said by any means. But, I guess I'll begin by saying that, it remains the case, although a little bit less prevalent in the revolutionary left's discussions than it was a few years ago, sadly, that the violence of borders is one of the most urgent incendiary kind of situations to be addressed in our present, and it kind of got reduced a little bit in discourse for reasons that I'm sort of partially sympathetic to. It's not like I don't understand the rationale to the question of kids in cages, in the US context at least, right? And in Europe it's often in a sense, I would posit like the image of Aylan Kurdi, the kid face down on the beach, drowned, washed up from the Mediterranean Sea, right? And this, so this idea, in a sense, you could link the two, right? The problem of kids in cages, the problem of Aylan Kurdi. I mean, I am completely in agreement with everyone who says that is, a deep and extraordinarily sort of mobilizing atrocity, right? An image of immediate colonial capitalist violence, right? That could perhaps animate revolutionary movement. But the risk if we translate that into slogans like "families belong together." Again, I'm slightly US biased, and I'm sorry about that. But where I live, the big sort of liberal progressive messages are keep families together, and families belong together, right? And this sounds fine, and it to all intents and purposes kind of works in a lot of cases as a proposition. If people are at the border and want to remain together or want to cross borders in order to be with one another, the language of family often works to effect, as a lever, in order to sort of allow people to, to make their way. But at what cost, right? That there's also, deeply, as queer people know, right, deeply dangerous, violent aspects to any kind of policy that, almost involuntarily or unconsensually reunites people with their biolegal kin, right? So if you think about Hillary Clinton helping deport children back to Honduras or whatever, that was sometimes, a case of deporting queer kids back to people who were going to beat or rape or murder them, because lest it needs saying, and I have to say, in a strange way, feminism and even queer discourse on the liberal left hasn't been so hard on this, so insistent on this as it used to be in the 70s, for instance. The nuclear household and the family is the site of an overwhelming amount of the interpersonal violence that takes place on this earth. This used to be kind of 101 stuff for feminists, women's liberationists, gay liberationists, for whom abolish the family was, a radical but a really familiar and well-known kind of demand and slogan in the 60s and 70s. And then it just all got forgotten in the 80s. And now it's sort of like, an alien has dropped out of the sky when you mention it nowadays, right? Because history is not, unidirectional. we don't just make progress, we forget things in a very systematic and structural way for reasons, But sorry, I really do ramble sometimes. Thanks for bearing with me. So, so I'm just proposing that, we understand an understanding of kinship as made, which we can and should take from indigenous thinkers, for instance, Kim Tallbear, right, who talks about settler sexuality and settler kinships and the deathly products of those forms of kinship, right? As an antidote to which is, perhaps an ethic and a politics of comradeliness that doesn't require you to prove, and how would you prove that? Via some kind of DNA test at the border, which you might laugh at that, but it literally has been implemented, right? There's been proposals to implement DNA tests at the Mexican border with the US to sort of somehow, verify that kin are kin, as though when you are a non-white subject proposing entry into the ethno-nationalist land of family values, TM, that kind of certification would buy you entry into whiteness and all its affordances, which is the fantasy and the logic behind this kind of this kind of policy proposal, and which perhaps even functions to a certain extent in some cases, to give you just enough kind of purchase on the sort of American dream / hamster wheel or whatever, where everyone is just a temporarily embarrassed millionaire and doesn't have a class, certainly not a working class subjectivity or positionality, and is probably going to escape from racial oppression any minute by dint of sort of striving and bootstrap positivity. So what if we said keep people together as a rather than keep families together, and people who want to be together belong together, which is, I admit, not quite as catchy, but I think is more in line with the tradition of anti-colonial, indigenous, and Black feminist struggle, which has demanded that prisons be abolished, police be abolished, borders be abolished. You could add schools, set in the settler colonial tradition of deep cultural violence that has been enacted on children through schools and the foster care system. I'll pause. If you could make sense of any of those sort of overexcited thoughts, I'll be impressed.
Yeah, no, that was amazing. Thank you so much for answering our questions. We've actually already come round to the time where we proposed having an access break just for people who need to take 5 minutes away from the screen. So we'll carry on kind of with questions after the break. But this is kind of the moment that we'd have an access break in case people need water or to go to the toilet or whatever. So Howard's going to enable the chat box so that people can kind of put questions for later on in the discussion box, and we'll kind of pick a few of them to kind of guide the rest of the discussion, if that sounds okay with everyone. Cool, that's really good. Thank you so much though for answering our questions. That was really good. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll be back in 5 minutes, everyone. So feel free to just turn your cameras and mics off, and we'll be resuming at 25 past.
Hi everyone. So we can resume now. So it's been really kind of great for us to chat about kind of family, care, COVID-19, all of that. and how it might kind of relate to us as students who are kind of navigating lockdown and kind of thinking about these very kind of abstract concepts in our own kind of daily lives and in our interactions with other people and the communities around us. So I think kind of on that note, it would be really good to kind of hear from the audience kind of about their thoughts, their opinions, any questions that they might have. So if you have any questions you want to ask, you can raise your hand in the participants bar, and I'll give the floor to you, I guess. You can also type questions into the chat bar, and we can pick questions up that way. So does anyone want to start us off by asking a question? Sophie.
Hi, sorry, I'm really bad with Teams. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I wanted to know whether you could elaborate a little bit on the points you made on private property and kind of like the violence in the family within that, because I was thinking about those of us who have to, you know, have housemates, many of them, people that we don't necessarily know, and kind of the way in which, with lockdowns and everything, life has been confined to your home, which sometimes is fine and it's great because it's like the community you picked, but also sometimes it's just because that's where you can afford rent. So yeah, I wondered whether that was something you could, I think it would be interesting to hear you speak on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point it's almost unimaginable for us, the idea of uncommodified property, you know? It's important to understand that in many ways, you know, our ability to know these things will have to be kind of you know, discovered, you know, through struggle, making the road as we walk, and so on and so forth, which is not just a kind of hand wavy thing of, you know, it will all be all right. That's not the understanding of utopia I have, where it will be kind of, you know, post-political, post-conflict, everything will be okay. You know, not at all. I understand utopianism as kind of an almost like pig-headed insistence on a livable world in the present that really engages with the world as we find it. And you know, private property, you know, is an amorphous beast. You know, ideological aspects of it, you know, invisible aspects of it. I don't know if in the UK there's this wave of kind of police almost marketing of these devices for your front door, these doorbells, these Amazon Ring doorbells, which are basically surveillance systems, which then kind of connect into these, you know, snitch apps, right? Kind of security databases for neighborhoods, which kind of grotesquely ape the idea of community and neighborhood by allowing you to kind of log suspicious behaviors outside your house, or, you know, supposedly these Ring, they're called Ring, right? Like video surveillance doorbells are supposed to help prevent porch pirates, right? Like petty thieves who steal your private property in the form of Amazon packages or whatever, off the doorstep of your larger private property, you know. And you know, there's this, so there are these kinds of almost simulacra of you know, of comradeliness, like the inversion, the horrible sort of perversion of looking out for one another, that is sort of sold to us through public-private partnerships in the form of like Amazon plus the police and security cameras, which literally promote and encourage the indulgence of our worst impulses, you know, our worst curtain twitching racisms and preconceptions about why someone is on the street. But when it comes to the issues you're talking about as well, with economic precarity, you know, the coercion, as we should really understand it, of the rent relation, the fact that, having a degree of kind of, even a degree of freedom about where we live is not something that the vast majority of us can say we have or really can even dream of having. And family abolitionism, in the very weird, problematic book by Shulamith Firestone from 1970, The Dialectic of Sex, about which I will always be up for talking. And in fact, I'm teaching a course online at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. If you fancy signing up, that's in March, just to plug my online teaching gig. But she, is sometimes just thought of as someone who talked about ectogenetic machines, but really a lot more of her text is dedicated to thinking about how children and adults, and children might be a category that might potentially have been abolished in her post-capitalist utopia, but how they might have developed a sense of consensual mutuality around household belonging, right? So it's deeply important for people to be able to decide not to live with people in a household, and that includes people we think of as children and minors and so on. For Firestone, this was super key, super important. I don't know really what to say beyond that. There is a romanticization of communal living, which is really just co-renting, and that's not really part of the politics that I'm interested in. I'm not into a sort of The Economist was reporting on how in the pandemic people are rediscovering a taste for housemates, and so long as that's simply just a way for labor power to be reproduced more cheaply and for landlords to make more money, then it's not in any way emancipatory, is it? And there's nothing wrong with private space. Sorry, I can see lots of people have their hands up, so please shut me up so we can get to more questions.
It's absolutely fine, no worries at all. I think the next hand up was Ben. So Ben, if you want to ask your question next.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd be interested. Am I audible? Yeah. I'd be interested to know a bit more about what your book means for children. I'm thinking like children as like people who need like quite a lot of care, and like we're aware of children as being very dependent, but then that's used to like undermine their agency. And I'm thinking like particularly about like how TERFism has expressed itself in the UK recently. So I'm wondering what kind of like political demands you'd make for like taking children seriously as subjects and agents, and like that kind of region of things.
Thank you. That's so vital. Yeah, so I'll just, I don't want to dodge the question at all. I want to just point out at this juncture, because it seems like a good opportunity to do so, that there's a small group of people that I know of, that I'm connected to, that I feel kind of clustered with, who are attempting to revive this idea of abolish the family in the 21st century from a trans, Marxist, feminist perspective. And the names to be aware of there are Madeline Lane McKinley, Kate Doyle Griffiths, Jules Joanne Gleason, and Michelle O'Brien. And all of those people, with the exception of Jules, are directly involved in raising children that they have a bodily connection with in a material sense that would be deemed in some sense traditional or biological, quote unquote. And so these family abolitionists are in the traditional sense mothers, right? And that's and Madeline in particular, Madeline Lane McKinley, has really focused her philosophical efforts on thinking about how to talk to children about family abolition, quote unquote. So how can you, in an era that has been, really sort of intellectually ravaged by sexual and moral panics around the figure of the paedophile and the securitization and shoring up of kind of property ideology that has been attendant on that. How can you revive the idea of children's liberation, and how can you have a child-led conversation about ensuring unconditional certainly very sustained and guaranteed for sort of a very long time for very young people form of care, while not blackmailing anyone and not ordering the world such that people are bound together violently, right? And the thing about conversations with children as I've known them is that they're real experts at this, and they're quite good at guiding political conversations about the freedom that should be central to the experiences of intimacy that we spend our short years on this earth enjoying, or should. So yeah, I guess I'm just being a bit glib here, but I think your question is key, and I think it is inextricable from the conversation about empowering freedom and autonomy to remake your gender, right? Which the TERFs in the UK are obviously mobilizing in very frightening fascioid ways to attack and erode. Because you can have no, abolition of the family separate from, an overthrow of capitalist social relations and also, gender liberation. That they're all kind of, unfortunately, deeply co-constitutive. Yeah. Okay. I don't know how satisfactory that was, but I'm going to move on.
Yeah, thank you for that. So on a related note, I guess, a bit of a related note, a question from the chat bar. Jack asks how your thoughts on family abolition and care kind of interact with schooling and education.
Yeah, it's not something I have devoted a lot of thought to. I live in Philadelphia, as does this organizer and friend of mine, Malcolm Harris, the author of a book called Kids These Days, who theorizes school as in a very real sense work that we get so-called children to do, right? And this is a contention he advances in an extremely serious Marxological way, and I think it's really important that this be integrated into the kinds of family abolitionist discussions that I'm involved in. I haven't done the I haven't really done the fleshing out. I think it's pretty clear to me that school is a really prominent site of the naturalization of dyadic, structurally, if not actually, cis hetero patriarchal kinds of norms. Parent-teacher associations and kind of ideas about who should be answerable or responsible for children's discipline and the doing of homework and so on are ineluctably and sort of covertly norming and gendering and racing and classing. Yeah, I haven't really given as much thought as I ought to the question of, how to, liberate schooling, which kind of includes teachers almost as much as it does, people who have to go to school, but it's, yeah, I mean, it's bad, isn't it? It's a bad situation right now. We get trained at school, as we do in the family. They go hand in hand, to be sort of binary gendered, classed, racialized subjects who are ready to become workers. That's kind of, in my view, unavoidably the real purpose and function of school.
Amazing, thank you so much. We're going to move on to a question now from, I think Carlotta's hand was next. I've lost track of the hands.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Just check. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for such an amazing talk. I was really interested in what you said about how family abolition used to be a more common feminist political idea and belief. Yeah, and I was wondering if you had any insights on why that's been forgotten. And then, like, why there is now increasingly a resurgence from a more queer, critical trans perspective.
Yeah. I would refer you maybe to an essay in Endnotes by Michelle O'Brien called "To Abolish the Family," and there's a wonderful piece by Jules Gleason and Kate Doyle Griffiths called "Kinderkommunismus," which I think will do a better job than I'll be able to off the cuff, kind of to synthesize these historical arcs and the material reasons for the sort of the resurgence in the wake of defeat, of impossibilist dreams, like the post-family care commune. But yeah, it's well, I think the 60s and 70s should be remembered as, a revolutionary opening that was crushed, right? It seems sort of simple, but I don't know if it's said enough. I mean, I'm going to say we. I realize that's a bit kind of, presumptuous, but we got defeated, right? We got defeated, and as Alice Eccles notes in her history of women's liberation, Daring to be Bad, it's a great book. It was the sort of deeply reactionary fringe strand of the women's movement, which she calls cultural feminists, who won out. They were the last women standing, and they got to write the history of what feminism was, right? So our understanding of the so-called second wave, although we should do away with wave metaphors and embrace the sort of no wave feminism, in my opinion, is it has just been written by the bioconservative kind of pro-work wounded attachment type turfy feminists who in fact were considered crap and reactionary 50 years ago. So and that's just something, that's just a question of kind of relearning our history and relearning that trans women were involved in feminist organizing from the 60s and 70s, and that in fact feminism became cis, as Emma Heaney importantly argues in her book The New Woman, as a result of modernist allegories of the trans feminine and sexological narratives and experiments from the late 19th century on to the early 20th. So there's so much about our history that we have to kind of relearn or learn for the first time and unlearn in order to understand that this is not a very hopeful message, but we're in a really extraordinarily shit moment in history, and that we need to reject the wrong kind of hope, the bad kind of hope the cruel optimism of forcing ourselves to to almost beat ourselves up for not being able to kind of vanquish our foes as we ought in the present. Sometimes I think the first task of a radical is to really truly get to grips with the hopelessness of the situation, and that's where a sort of hope against hope can begin to form and materialize. That's a phrase from my writing collective Out of the Woods, which has a book out on ecological crisis called Out of the Woods, Hope Against Hope. The writing collective is called Out of the Woods. But yeah, I mean, I think it's not surprising that recently there has been a renewed interest in the family abolitionist horizons of the 60s and 70s. And of course, it was also a 19th century utopian socialist theme that was quite well known. So, it's not new. But the reasons for the resurgence might be attributed to, various kind of macro sort of economic phenomena, like the collapse of academia and jobs generally, and the phenomenon of having to go back and live with your parents or whatever, and the ecological collapse that makes the prospect of coupling up, settling down, and manufacturing babies perhaps a little bit more questionable than it had hitherto. I think more things paradoxically are on the table, even as they seem more unthinkable than ever before, because the end of history has been upon us for long enough that we collectively really fear and hope simultaneously that that another world will come about in our lifetimes. So radicalisms have reared their head anew on both the far left and the far right.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think your comments about like schooling and about like knowing history kind of made me think about like how schools often perform the functions of families and parents, and like kind of with the lockdown, and there was a whole scandal and controversy over free school meals and students having to stay at home during half-term break and kind of losing access to those vital social services, and how, I mean, it's very tangential, but like the parallels between that and like, for example, the Black Panthers providing meals to school children in Oakland, and kind of how, what that says about like schooling and care and education and all of that. So we have a question from David who asks, could you talk about the need, if you see it, of a radical politics of care for the increasing numbers of queer people who are older, suffering dementia, Alzheimer's, who in many cases will not have a nuclear family to support them, in the context of increasing care being tendered to private companies?
Yeah, I'm really, delighted, humbled, curious, educated, increasingly by people who are implementing my book in the context of disability liberation and disability justice. I recently got to participate in a discussion organized by people on the Death Panel podcast, which is a really fantastic kind of network of self-organizing, disability radicals, and all those themes that you've mentioned in your question were kind of central. And the people running the group are both, deeply utopian and very kind of policy literate, and much more so than I am. And so very humbly and respectfully, I'm going to just say that, you know, this strikes me as, you know, a big area my book does not go into. I mean, you know, not to be defensive or overly kind of self-deprecating either, you know, but you know, my book is about you know, gestational labor, and looks to a particular clinic to illustrate certain kinds of rhetorical contradictions about gestationality and capital. But of course, I could have also looked at the ways that you know, the same sorts of more you know, metaphorical issues of holding and letting go that I insist are not just purely literally gestational, but also about transgenerational and intragenerational, you know, mutual aid, you know, are particularly sort of sharp as contradictions and necessities and urgent political imperatives amongst you know, people who are living with for instance autism or Alzheimer's or immunocompromised vulnerabilities in this pandemic. Yeah, I mean, just I was learning so much in that discussion about how the concerns of family abolition are really quite old and familiar, and intensively sort of worked over tropes for non-neurotypical and disabled communists, you know. So I was really kind of fascinated by my own ignorance. Yeah, and family abuse in the context of disability is a whole area that I have perhaps neglected to connect, right, to my sort of own genealogy, which is kind of wages for housework, Black feminism, queer Marxism. Yeah, and I know that Alison Kafer has a book called I think Manifesting Crip Care, or a paper, which I think would be a great resource for people interested in what you've just very rightly raised. Thank you.
Hi, we actually had one more question to maybe kind of end it on a bit more of a fun note. A lot of people in both of our campaigns followed the octopus discourse quite closely, and we wondered if you wanted to say anything about that in relation to our discussion. Yeah, basically, yeah, we just thought it'd be a really fun way to end.
I didn't expect that. So that's delightful. I actually, you will literally be the first people to know this. I'm about to publish a piece about that whole imbroglio with N+1, and I've really enjoyed writing this essay. I'm sort of hoping that people read it, because it was one of the most sort of interesting things for me to write that I've ever written. I've just done the fact check, which was a really rigorous process on the part of N+1's magazine editor, because the claims I was making about, you know, what on earth was going on the internet were, you know, in itself quite kind of octopus-like and unboundaried, you know, trying to hunt down screen grabs of people saying that, you know, civilization needed to end and the planet should be obliterated, because I had sort of noticed that an octopus was a bit sexy, you know, it seemed a little kind of, you know, surreal at the time. But you know, I don't know what to offer you. I'm always kind of suddenly wondering if I should read you a tiny little snippet of this essay. I've pulled it up. I mean, that is not something I was prepared for, but yeah. I hope that you were all on team erotic octopus. It was, you know, I mean, on a more serious note, it was it was a seriously, you know, sobering encounter with different kinds of discourses of erotophobia and sort of trauma-involved sex negativity, and you know, lots of sorts of analyses about my homophobia as you know, so perceived by talking about queerness in a context of kind of non-porno mechanical eros, right? You know, I mean, I will read you one line which I hope will make the point I just tried to make a little bit more obvious. Let's see. So, okay, yeah, here we go. If I may, I will take advantage of this occasion to say, this really is foremost for me among the many things one might wish to say to the "did he fuck the octopus" crowd. Look, how hubristic can you get? She has literally 8 arms. Speaking purely probabilistically, if someone was going to get fucked in this scenario, which one of the 2 of them do you think it would be? I guess that's as good a place as any to end. I hope you look out for that piece. I think it should be online in the next couple of weeks.
I really feel as if we've ended entering the Cthulhu scene, so that was really great. Thank you so much. And sorry for springing that question on you. We thought if we had time at the end, it would be good to end on that note. Thank you so much. This has been such a good discussion. Do you have any kind of like last remarks you want to make? Probably, like, it's fine not to after we just ditch the whole octopus question on you. But thank you so much.
No, I've really appreciated this. Thank you for having me. Not to sound like a YouTuber with the whole sort of like and subscribe routine, but seriously, if people have things to say or ask or want to make contact or want to explore these ideas and get pointers to any of the sort of you know, anti-racist family abolitionist resources that I'm, you know, playing with, I have a Twitter that is Repro Utopia. It's also my Patreon, and that's a way to get in touch with me if you want. Repro as in reproduction, one word, Utopia. So yeah, I'm always really keen to make connections with you know, radicals and particularly people a little bit younger than me at this point. So, you know, to keep me real, to keep me grounded. Thanks for having me. I think I'll say goodbye then.
Yeah,
good luck to all of you on the rainy fascism island.
Yeah.
Not that it's really any better over here in the ostensibly post-Trump era, but yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.